Mark Wallace looked like the kind of husband every woman dreamed of: steady, charming, dependable. Jenna Wallace believed that too, until the night her best friend, Lisa Grant, came over for dinner and never truly left. Beneath Mark's calm smile hid a darkness he'd been feeding for months, a secret that began with lies and ended in blood. When the storm passed, and he thought both women were dead, one faint breath shattered his perfect plan. That single heartbeat turned a husband's hidden crime into a nightmare he could never escape. Mark and Jenna Wallace had been the couple everyone in the neighborhood looked up to. From the outside, their life looked almost cinematic: an elegant house on a tree-lined street, weekend barbecues, and social media posts filled with laughter. Mark was a successful architect known for his charm and composure. Jenna, with a radiant smile and generous spirit, worked as an event planner whose clients adored her. To the world, they were the definition of a perfect marriage. But behind that calm, carefully polished image, there were cracks, forming cracks no one could see until it was far too late. It began quietly, the way most disasters do. Mark's business had started to falter. He had invested in a risky project, convinced it would bring quick profit, but it failed miserably, leaving him with mounting debt. He didn't tell Jenna at first. He kept pretending everything was fine, covering up the losses by transferring money from their joint account. He planned to replace it later, but later never came. When Jenna began noticing missing funds, her suspicion grew. She didn't accuse him outright, but her eyes lingered on him longer. Her questions became sharper, and her trust, once effortless, started to fade. Then came Lisa Grant, Jenna's best friend since college. She'd recently moved back to town after a painful divorce and rented the house right next door. Lisa was confident, outspoken, and far more observant than Mark liked. Her presence unsettled him. She was always around, helping Jenna plan events, joining them for dinner, or dropping by unannounced with wine and laughter. To Jenna, Lisa's return was a blessing, a friend to lean on during difficult times. To Mark, it felt like an intrusion. Every conversation between the two women made him paranoid. He was certain they were talking about him, whispering about the missing money, maybe even about his late-night phone calls with the woman from work. Jenna had always believed in confronting problems with calm honesty. Mark preferred silence and control. When she started keeping financial records in a separate folder, his irritation turned into rage. One evening, he overheard Lisa advising Jenna to look deeper if she suspected something. That phrase stuck in his mind like a nail. Look deeper. He imagined Lisa telling Jenna everything, turning her against him, exposing the affair he had barely managed to hide. He told himself Lisa was the root of the problem, the person who had made Jenna suspicious in the first place. As the days passed, the tension grew thick and heavy. Mark started avoiding dinners and spent more time in his office, pretending to work late. Jenna sensed his distance, but didn't know the storm brewing inside him. On the surface, Mark appeared calm, polite, and measured, but his mind was a labyrinth of fear and resentment. He replayed scenarios in his head: Jenna leaving him, Lisa mocking him, the world discovering his lies. His perfect image would crumble, and he couldn't allow that. Then came the day that changed everything. Jenna announced that Lisa would be joining them for dinner that Friday to finalize plans for the charity gala they were hosting. Mark smiled and agreed, but inside, something broke. The idea of those two women together again, whispering about him, planning their next step, filled him with a cold certainty that this would have to end. He convinced himself it was the only way to regain control. That night, as he stood by the window watching the sun sink behind the houses, Mark's reflection stared back at him, calm, still, and detached. It was the face of a man who had already made his decision. In his mind, what he was about to do wasn't murder. It was correction, a way to silence the voices that threatened his perfect world. The rain began to fall outside, tapping softly against the glass, and for the first time in weeks, Mark felt at peace. The rain began early that evening, a slow drizzle that deepened into a heavy storm by nightfall. The thunder outside masked the tension that had been building inside the Wallace home for weeks. Mark had spent the entire day rehearsing every move in his mind. He had thought about timing, about noise, about what to say and when to say it. He wanted the night to appear ordinary, calm, unremarkable. If he could make it look like a normal evening, no one would ever suspect what he had done when the sun rose again. Jenna was in high spirits, despite the weather. She loved storms, always saying they made her feel safe indoors. She had set the dining table with candles and a small bouquet of lilies Lisa had brought over earlier. When Lisa arrived, shaking rain from her umbrella, the house filled with her laughter. She was wearing her favorite red sweater, the one Mark hated because it made her stand out too much. The two women began talking and planning as if nothing in the world was wrong. To them, it was another night of friendship. To Mark, it was the night everything would end. He poured wine for them both, careful to pour his last. His movements were precise, deliberate, almost graceful. He smiled when Jenna caught his eye, and she smiled back, unaware of the storm raging behind his calm expression. The three of them sat together, and for a brief moment, the night felt normal. The sound of rain against the windows blended with their conversation, but under the surface, Mark's thoughts ran dark. He kept thinking about the look on Lisa's face when she'd once said Jenna deserved better. That single comment had never left him. He had taken it personally, and now, in his twisted logic, it had become justification. As the hours passed, Mark waited for the right moment. He wanted control, perfect timing, no mistakes. When Jenna left the table to take a phone call in the hallway, the opportunity came. Lisa stayed behind, scrolling through her phone and sipping her wine. Mark stood, moved behind her, and did what he had been imagining for days. It was quick, practiced, and silent. Lisa's glass shattered as it hit the floor, drowned out by the thunder outside. When Jenna returned moments later, confusion turned to shock, then horror. She dropped her phone, her voice trembling as she tried to understand what had happened. Mark didn't give her the chance. In the blur that followed, the room filled with chaos struggles, the sound of falling objects, and then nothing but the steady hum of the storm. When it was over, Mark stood in silence, his breath heavy and uneven. The faint flicker of candlelight danced across the floor where both women lay motionless. For a long time, Ehust stared. The reality of what he had done hadn't fully reached him yet. He felt detached, almost outside of himself. He worked mechanically after that. He dragged the bodies into the garage, one at a time, trying not to look at their faces. He thought about what story he would tell if someone asked about them. Maybe they had gone out for the night. Maybe they'd been caught in the storm. Every possibility ran through his head as he cleaned the kitchen, wiped the counters, and erased every trace of what had happened. He checked the locks, turned off the lights, and looked at the clock. It was just after midnight. The storm was beginning to die down when he finally stepped back into the garage. He stood over them again, this time to make sure. Jenna's face was pale, still, unreal. Lisa's body was limp and cold, or so he thought. He didn't notice the faint rise and fall of her chest under the dim light. The air felt heavy, suffocating, yet calm. To Mark, it was over. The threat was gone, the problem solved. He went to bed before dawn, exhausted but strangely serene. Outside, the rain stopped, leaving behind the smell of wet earth and silence. Inside the garage, beneath the flickering bulb, Lisa's chest lifted once more, shallow but alive. The one mistake Mark didn't see was the one that would end up destroying everything he had tried to protect. Mark woke before sunrise, his head pounding with the remnants of exhaustion and adrenaline. The storm had passed, leaving behind a dull gray sky that seeped through the blinds. For a few moments, he lay still, trying to convince himself that it had all been a dream. But the ache in his shoulders and the faint metallic smell clinging to his hands reminded him that it wasn't. Everything that had happened last night was real. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Still, he told himself, it was done. There was nothing to fear now. He walked downstairs in silence, his footsteps careful and measured. The house felt unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that made every small sound louder. He avoided the kitchen, knowing he couldn't bear to see the faint stains that might still remain, no matter how hard he had cleaned. Instead, he went straight to the garage. The air inside was cool, carrying the lingering scent of gasoline and damp concrete. For a moment, he hesitated before turning on the light. When he did, the flickering bulb revealed everything exactly as he had left it. The two bodies were side by side, covered loosely with a tarp. Mark's eyes fixed on the stillness, searching for reassurance. He didn't feel guilt, only a hollow relief. He crouched beside them, checking for movement, and seeing none, he let out a slow breath. It was over. He would get rid of them later, after dark. By then, no one would suspect a thing. He convinced himself he had time. He returned to the kitchen and started building his alibi. He would say Jenna and Lisa had gone out after dinner to pick something up for the event. He had fallen asleep waiting for them. When morning came and they still hadn't returned, he had assumed they stayed over at Lisa's. Simple, believable, safe. Mark repeated the story in his head until it sounded natural. Then he took a shower, put on clean clothes, and tried to act normal. But when he stepped outside to take the trash out, he caught sight of something that made his stomach twist. A small trail of faint red, smudges leading from the side door toward the garage. He crouched to wipe them away, heart racing. But before he could finish, he heard the distant sound of a phone vibrating. The noise was muffled, coming from somewhere inside the garage. He froze. Slowly, he pushed the door open again and followed the sound. It was faint but steady, a rhythmic pulse that grew louder as he approached the tarp. The phone was inside Lisa's pocket. That alone made him uneasy, but what made his blood run cold was what he saw next. The tarp moved, just a small twitch at first, barely noticeable, but enough to make him stumble back. He stared, his breath caught in his throat. Then he saw it again, a faint, shallow rise and fall beneath the plastic. Lisa was breathing. For several seconds, his mind went blank. Every plan he had made, every detail he had thought through, fell apart in an instant. She wasn't supposed to be alive. It was impossible. Yet there she was, her body fighting for life. Panic surged through him. He thought about finishing what he started, but his hands trembled, his pulse roaring in his ears. He couldn't do it. Not again. Instead, he stumbled backward, out of the garage, shutting the door behind him. He stood in the kitchen, gasping for air, his thoughts spiraling. He needed to think clearly, but fear had taken over reason. What if she woke up? What if she remembered? What if she told someone? He tried to calm himself by believing she wouldn't make it, that she was too weak. But deep down he knew the truth: she was alive. And that meant his secret was already slipping through his fingers. In his panic, he forgot one crucial thing. Lisa's phone was still on, and while he had been too focused on his fear, a message had already gone through. Location alert, automatically sent to her friend after hours of inactivity. The signal pinged from the Wallace address. By the time Mark finally convinced himself everything was under control, the first call to the police had already been made. The sound of sirens, though still far away, would soon be the next thing he heard. Lisa opened her eyes to a blinding white light that made everything blur. Her chest burned with every breath, her throat dry, her head pounding. At first, she didn't know where she was or what had happened. Machines beeped softly nearby, and she felt something cold attached to her wrist. When she tried to move, a sharp pain reminded her that her body wasn't ready yet. Panic flashed through her as fragments of memory began to surface: the storm, the laughter at dinner, the taste of wine, and then something violent and dark. A flash of Mark's face hovered in her mind, his expression empty and calm. She couldn't remember everything, but she remembered enough to know that something terrible had happened. Doctors told her she had been found barely alive in a suburban garage. Her body had been discovered after a location alert from her phone brought police to the Wallace home. Jenna hadn't survived. Lisa's injuries were severe, but she was the lucky one. She had been taken to the hospital unconscious, with no guarantee she'd make it through the night. Now, lying under harsh hospital lights, she realized that luck came with a heavy price. She was the only witness. Detectives arrived not long after she regained partial consciousness. They spoke gently, careful not to push too hard, but their questions were sharp. Did she remember what happened? Could she identify who hurt her? Lisa struggled to find words. Her memory was foggy, fragmented, as if someone had scattered her thoughts into pieces, but certain images refused to fade. The red sweater she had been wearing, the sound of glass breaking, and Mark's silhouette moving toward her just before everything went black. Even if she couldn't recall the exact sequence, she knew one thing with chilling certainty: Mark Wallace had done it. While Lisa fought to recover, detectives worked tirelessly to piece together the evidence. What they found in the Wallace home told a story that didn't need many words. The wine glasses on the table tested positive for a sedative. Fingerprints smeared across the kitchen counter matched Mark's. Drag marks led from the dining room to the garage, where traces of cleaning agents were found near faint bloodstains. There was even a faint print of Mark's shoe on the tarp that had been used to cover the buddies. It was sloppy work for a man who thought he was meticulous. When police arrived that morning, Mark had tried to act surprised. He told them Jenna and Lisa had gone out during the storm and never returned. His tone was calm, rehearsed, but his story began to crack when officers noticed inconsistencies. He couldn't explain the wet footprints on the garage floor or why there were traces of blood beneath the tarp. Within hours, he went from being a concerned husband to the primary suspect in a double homicide. As the investigation deepened, Lisa's fragmented memories started to form a clearer picture. She remembered Jenna getting up to take a call. She remembered looking down at her glass and feeling dizzy, and then the sudden blur of motion. She remembered the smell of rain and the sound of thunder as she hit the floor. But most haunting of all, she remembered opening her eyes briefly in the garage, her vision fading in and out, seeing Mark's shoes moving near her before everything went black again. News of the case spread quickly through the neighborhood. People who had once admired Mark and Jenna's seemingly perfect marriage now spoke of the tragedy in whispers. Reporters called it the breath that spoke, the case of a killer husband undone by the faintest sign of life. Forensic analysts confirmed that if the police had arrived even an hour later, Lisa would have died from blood loss and exposure. Her survival wasn't just a miracle, it was the single reason Mark's lies began to unravel. When detectives confronted him with the evidence, Mark maintained his innocence. He claimed the women had argued and that he had found him hurt after returning home from a drive. But his story collapsed when the lab matched traces of sedative in the wine to the bottle he had purchased that afternoon. Even without Lisa as a full memory, the physical evidence was enough to prove he was lying. Lisa spent weeks in recovery, her body healing faster than her mind. Every night, she replayed the moments before the attack, trying to understand why. The answer came slowly, through police reports and whispered details she overheard. It wasn't jealousy or rig, it was desperation. Mark had been drowning in debt, terrified Jenna would expose him, and had decided that if he couldn't control the truth, he would erase it. But he had miscalculated. He hadn't noticed her breath. He hadn't seen the small rise of her chest that would bring everything crashing down. By the time Lisa was strong enough to leave the hospital, Mark was already in custody, awaiting trial. The man who had once been admired by everyone now sat in silence behind bars, his polished charm stripped away. The story wasn't over, but Lisa had survived long enough to make sure it would be told. The courtroom was packed on the day Mark Wallace went to trial. Reporters filled the benches, cameras flashed, and the air buzzed with tension. People from the neighborhood who once greeted Mark with smiles now stared at him in disbelief. He sat at the defense table in a gray suit, hands folded, eyes fixed straight ahead. His face was thinner, his expression emotionless. It was as if he had accepted that the version of himself he once showed the world no longer existed. Across the room sat Lisa, fragile but composed, her eyes steady on the man who had tried to end her life. The prosecution painted a picture of a man driven by greed and fear. They presented financial records showing how deeply Mark was in debt, the hidden transfers from his wife's account, and the affair he had tried to conceal. The motive was clear. He feared losing everything once Jenna discovered the truth. They described how the dinner that night had been premeditated, the wine laced with sedatives, the calculated silence of a husband who'd already decided the fate of 2 women. Every detail was supported by evidence: fingerprints, drug traces, blood patterns, and digital records. The defense tried to argue that the killings were not intentional. They suggested it had been a heated argument that spiraled out of control, that Mark had panicked and made mistakes out of fear. But the cold precision of his actions told another story. He had planned the night down to the smallest detail. He had bought the sedatives hours before, chosen the storm as cover, and carefully cleaned the scene. The only thing he hadn't planned for was Lisa's survival. That single breath had undone everything. When Lisa took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. She spoke slowly, her voice soft but unwavering. She told the jury about the laughter at dinner, the sudden dizziness, and the blur that followed. She described waking up in the garage, cold and disoriented, seeing faint light from beneath the tarp before everything went dark again. Her words carried weight, not because they were dramatic, but because they were real. Every sentence felt like a reminder that life had tried to leave her body that night, and somehow it hadn't. The prosecution ended its case with a chilling reminder that if Lisa's phone had not sent a location alert, both women would have vanished without a trace. The evidence would have been lost, the truth buried forever under Mark's lies. The courtroom sat in heavy silence as the jury was dismissed to deliberate. Outside, rain began to fall again, faintly tapping against the courthouse windows, echoing the storm from that night months ago. Hours passed before the jury returned. When the foreman stood, the room held its breath. The verdict was clear: guilty of murder and attempted murder. Mark didn't flinch. His eyes remained fixed on the floor, his shoulders rigid. It was as though the weight of his own choices had already crushed him long before the sentence was spoken. The judge's voice was calm but firm as he handed down a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Mark Wallace was led away in silence, the sound of his chains faint beneath the murmurs of the crowd. For Lisa, it didn't feel like victory. There was no sense of triumph in seeing justice served, only relief, quiet and fragile. She had survived, but survival came with memories she could never escape. In the weeks that followed, she packed her things and left town. The house next door was sold, the street eventually returning to its calm routine. Neighbors no longer spoke openly about what had happened, but the story lingered in whispers to the perfect husband who wasn't perfect at all, and the woman who lived because of one breath. Years later, Lisa would look back on that night and wonder how something as simple as air in her lungs had changed everything. The faintest breath had exposed a killer, shattered a Fukaday, and brought truth to light. Mark's name faded from headlines, replaced by newer scandals and tragedies. But in that quiet neighborhood, people still remembered. They remembered the storm, the sirens before dawn, and the haunting image of a woman who refused to die. Lisa never gave another interview. She turned down book offers and documentaries, choosing silence over fame. For her, the story didn't need retelling. It already existed in the spaces she could never forget, in the sound of rain, in the flicker of a candle, in the memory of 2 friends who laughed together one last time before everything changed. And though justice had been served, the truth remained heavy. The night she lived was the same night she lost everything.